Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Patty Katz. I'm the president of Reach Out America. I hope everyone got a chance to read Rita Hall's letter to the editor in yesterday's New York Times. Great job, Rita. Really kudos to you, man. That was pretty exciting. Yesterday, the Senate voted that the impeachment trial was constitutional, and it's going on as we speak. So hopefully Trump will be convicted, and so he can never run for office again. And since our meeting last month, we all witnessed a transcendent and inspiring inauguration day and evening where compassion, integrity, eloquence, patriotism, and talent were allowed back in Washington. Most of us cried with relief to hear our newly elected leaders raise us up as opposed to tearing us down, and strived for a reunited States of America in unity and acceptance. A new star arose with Amanda Gorton, the 22-year-old youth poet laureate, who read her uplifting poem, The Hill We Climb, setting the tone for a new administration's commitment to the betterment of humanity. Even from his first day, President Biden got to work and started overturning the many catastrophic legislations that Trump subjected us to. Just to name a few from his first week of office, rescinding the travel ban on several predominantly Muslim countries, rejoining the Paris Climate Change Accord, extending pandemic-related limits on evictions and student loan payments, issuing a mask mandate for federal property and interstate travel, ordering agencies to figure out how to reunite children with their families from crossing the border, working on the 1.9 trillion stimulus package and pandemic relief, scrapping the transgender military ban and banning discrimination on gender or sexual identity, and canceling the XL pipeline and paused oil and gas leasing in the Arctic, and reinforcing Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. So that's amazing. That was the first week. This is all wonderful news. It's my prediction that we will not be seeing President Biden or Vice President Harris playing much golf on taxpayers' money. They are working hard, and they just flew out of that gate so fast, and I don't think they're going to slow down. So, you know, it's pretty exciting what's going on. So we have a very exciting speaker today. I would like to now turn the virtual floor over to Nina Gordon to introduce him. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Spencer Sunshine, who I met through my daughter, who's a political activist. Spencer is a researcher, writer, activist, speaker, and political consultant regarding far-right movements, who since 2005 has written extensively about the far right in America. And this includes post-war fascism, the Patriot militia movement, left-right crossover movements, as well as anti-Semitic currents on both the left and right. Spencer was present at the armed takeover of Oregon's Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in January 2016. And in August 2017, he was part of the counter demonstration against the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and was in the crowd during the car attack, which killed Heather Heyer and injured about 30 others. Spencer has a doctorate in sociology. His work has been published and translated into numerous languages, and he is a frequent contributor to the German press. A sought-after speaker, Spencer has held speaking tours in Germany and Eastern Canada, and from 2013 to 19 was a fellow at the think tank Political Research Associates. I'm not going to waste any more time because there's a lot more accolades, but I will put into the chat box information as to how you can follow Spencer and his writings and support him, because he is a freelance journalist, and as such, he does not get a steady paycheck. So without further ado.
Thank you. I just want to say first, the words President Biden is so soothing to me. I was just like, oh. So I'm happy to be here with Reach Out America. As some people might know, I came right before everything came down with the pandemic when my colleague Chip Relay spoke in person. It was actually Chip's last talk after a 40-year career writing about and monitoring the far right. So I was very happy that you could host him. And we had a special visitor at that talk who we can talk about later, who has since drawn some national attention. But right now I'm going to talk about the far right. I'm going to go over a bit of its history, talk about where it is right now and where we think it might go in the future. So there's many different ways that different scholars define the far right. And the way that I think about it, and this is an altered version of how Chip Roullet and Matthew Lyons, something they call right-wing populism in their book, Right-Wing Populism in America. I define it as a kind of conservative opposition to both equality and democracy, which seeks to retain traditional social hierarchies. It may or may not be supportive of a kind of free market capitalism as we know it. It's one of its unique features that distinguishes the far right from other right-wing elements that we usually see in American society. So one thing that people don't realize is this has always been part of American political culture. Going back to the 1790s, there were anti-Masonic conspiracy theories. Andrew Jackson's presidency in the late 1820s and the 1830s was a very virulently racist, right-wing populist administration. It's no surprise that Donald Trump often said that Jackson was his favorite president. There were many waves of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s, in the 1920s, which was the really big one that had millions of people, in the 1950s, in the 1970s, and later on. And as you might know, there at least used to be a Klan chapter on Long Island, although in the latest Southern Poverty Law Center hate map, it's not listed, so it may have collapsed. But for years, there was one on Long Island. There were also, people probably remember the anti-communism of the 50s and 60s, which included McCarthy and the John Birch Society, another group that still exists and is influential on the far right, the militia movements, and the neo-Nazis. So, and today we have anti-immigrant xenophobes, Islamophobes, and anti-Semites, right-wing conspiracy theories like QAnon, and of course, Trump, in my view, is sort of the softest of the far right. You know, he didn't really have I hate to say his name even, but, you know, he didn't really have a consistent ideology, but he did, you know, often express elements of the far right. And then the hardest of them being fascist and neo-Nazis, the most extreme of which advocate terrorism. So this is what the far right, how I think of the far right, and this is how it's been a permanent fixture of the American political system. And we should remember that when we go forward and talk about its rise and fall in recent years. So today's far right really came out of the reaction to Obama's election. A lot of the far right functions as a reaction to progressive social movements and progressive elected officials. So with Obama's election, you may remember the Tea Party exploded, and there was also a new wave of the militia movement. Groups like the Oath Keepers formed, and the Three Percenters. Both of those were very active in the Capitol takeover. Some of the most egregious arrests are a group of Oath Keepers who worked in tandem to go enter the Capitol and were very aggressive in the takeover. Around 2015, when Trump started his campaign, he sort of poured gasoline on the fire of the far right. It had been a little more bound at that point and then suddenly exploded. That's the time the alt-right emerged onto the national stage. It had been around since 2010 or so, like these other groups, but that's when it expanded quite dramatically. And then the Proud Boys, who are very visible today, founded in 2016. So there's this moment right when Trump starts the campaign that becomes another big explosion of the far right after 2009, 2010. So as I'm sure everybody remembers, throughout Trump's presidency, the far right was very active. I'm not going to go through it blow by blow, but I will point out a couple major events in it. First off, the fascist wing, people like Richard Spencer and the Traditionalist Worker Party, basically collapsed by early 2018. You know, the TWP as a party imploded. Spencer canceled his college tours under pressure from above and below. And then after that, and will be important for the Capitol takeover, more moderate political groups became the most aggressive groups in the street forces of the Trumpist far right, in particular the Proud Boys, as well as out west another group called Patriot Prayer. And so there was sort of a switch in which the more extreme groups became more moderate in their approach, and the more moderate groups became more extreme in their approach. And so more recently, with QAnon in particular, but also fueled by all of Trump's claims of there being a stolen election, an even more moderate than the Proud Boys part of the Trumpist far right has also become more aggressive. And this is what we saw in the Capitol takeover, and we may see more of in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Capitol takeover. I have a different perspective than many people do on this. I don't think it was a coup. This is, often said, or attempted coup. And I'll tell you why. I don't think there was premeditation for this, at least not from very many people. And if it had been an attempted coup, then Trump had his chance, right? They took the Capitol over. They clearly didn't really have a plan. It seems like a small number of people did act in concert to force their way further in. But it seems like if they really had a plan, they could have gotten at least into the floor where the House was meeting. And they didn't do that until the House was evacuated. Well, I think they maybe didn't do that at all, and they got into the Senate. It wasn't acted coordinated to go push in very much by very few people. And anyway, Trump had his moment then, right? They took the Capitol over. That would have been the time for Trump to declare himself dictator and dismiss the Congress, and he didn't do it. So that's why I don't think it was a coup. That's why I call it a takeover or an attack. The second thing is, and I'll go into this, I think it's wrong to primarily label the people who are there as white supremacists. And I'll talk about that in a bit. I think they were fairly moderate Trumpists with some more further right elements mixed into it. So what set up the environment for the takeover to happen? Trump had, of course, for many months, or really since the election, said that the election was stolen. These were lies. This was repeated, again and again and again on right-wing media, which for a lot of these people creates a kind of information silo, and they don't listen to any other media sources. And, of course, the right-wing media sources are not fact-checked. They're full of conspiracy theories. They're highly ideological. But it was also magnified by even not just the explicitly right-wing media, but by social media platforms who didn't stop Trump from posting on it, didn't stop people from regurgitating his lies. I mean, in particular, Twitter. And of course, Twitter could have stopped this. They did start putting at some point, notes and warnings on his tweets. But, they showed by suspending him later on, they could have suspended him at the very beginning. He was always in violation of their terms of service. They always had a legal ability to suspend him. And I think it's very telling that they didn't wait until really everything was over to suspend him. And they helped magnify and create this crowd by allowing him to function on their platform. So I also want to go into a little bit about the labeling of the people who took over the Capitol as white supremacists, because I think this is important for some of our understanding about what actually went on. It's true that the group was a large, primarily white and right-wing group, and it's true that groups like this are treated more leniently by law enforcement. And we've seen this again and again and again in Portland in particular, where clashes have gone on for years. There's plenty of evidence there that the police were far more lenient with far-right figures. There were cases of people who were well-known activists with warrants out for them that the police neither did apprehend them on the scene or apprehend them afterwards. There's one case of a guy waving a gun around in public who wasn't arrested until 2 weeks later. And although in some of these cases the people were arrested, it allowed them to dominate the streets, right? And so there's lots of instances like this. It's happened in other cities too. And so it's true that the authorities will treat far-right groups on the street much more lenient than other groups. But the problem with, I think, calling them white supremacists is that if that had been a left-wing march of the same demographics, there's no way in hell they would have treated it the same way. Anyone who's been on these big left-wing marches knows, I mean, if that had been a left-wing march against Trump, there would have been National Guard lined up in front of the Capitol. They would have the Guard would have all had plastic handcuffs. There would have been 20 buses ready to take people away. The jails would have been emptied. And, we've seen that again and again and again. So I don't think it's exactly a racial question. There were also so there were also almost no explicitly white supremacist groups involved, groups that saw themselves as white supremacists or white nationalists. The main organized group was a group called the Groypers. They have taken the tact of instead of having an independent white supremacist movement, they're trying to do an entryist move into the Trumpists to try to drive them further to the right. They were there with these flags with an AF on them. So, but they were really the only organized white supremacist group there. So a lot of them were more moderate Trumpists. In fact, one study showed that 90% of people arrested were not from organized far-right groups. So only 10% were. They were Proud Boys and militias mostly. If people saw the guy with the Camp Auschwitz shirt, that's of course very disturbing, but I want to point out that's one guy and he wasn't with a group. So of the thousands, many thousands of people there. So it is true that many Trumpists do have racialized views, although they're not supporters in general of segregation or of an open white supremacy or of expelling people of color from the country. They're anti-immigrant, they're anti-Black Lives Matter, they're Islamophobic, and at times Trump has made swipes at different ethnic and racial groups. Calling Mexican immigrants racist and murderers, calling African countries shitholes, but he's not been consistent about the other things. So there is racism there. But I think that the Capitol Police and others would have treated this right-wing demonstration the same if they had been some other kind of right-wing group that didn't traffic in racialized bigotry. If it had been like a far-right Christian right group that was super homophobic or just anti-left-wing, I think they would have dealt with them the same way. So this is one of the questions about, labeling them and the reaction as white supremacist. There's also, it depends on the people who are talking about it. Different people who are progressives use the term white supremacy in different ways. So a common way that the left uses it is to cover everything from like little things that all white people will do, things that are already in our educational system and our way of understanding things, and then in a big spectrum all the way to like the Ku Klux Klan. And there's a lot to say about that perspective, and it adds a lot of things. And I want to say it is true in a way, but it's a sort of really broad view perspective. It's like, looking at things from here, from a really far out scope. Now, other people, and this is, the usual thing amongst experts who study the far right, is that white supremacist is used as a very, very specific category of far right people. These are generally very subconsciously white supremacists. They talk about being for white people. Their groups are only for white people. The Trumpist and militia groups and the Proud Boys, they do welcome in all people from all racial backgrounds. They do accept, gay men and Jews and stuff. This is quite different from organized white supremacist groups who wouldn't accept any of these things. So there's these two different terms in use. And so, as I said, the first one is useful in certain circumstances, but if you invoke this, it would cover all right-wing groups. I mean, people say George Bush was a white supremacist, neoliberals are white supremacists, centrist Democrats are white supremacists. You'll hear that Bernie Sanders is a white supremacist. So it doesn't tell us a lot about the people who are actually there. So when you zoom in, there's two views, the really broad one and there's the one that's zoomed in. And so I think we should use it in a very limited sense, the term in a very limited sense, because this will help us, and so not apply it to what happened at the Capitol takeover, because this will help us understand which groups were there, which factions were there. And these factions have different aims and goals. The far right and the right wing in general, it's not a monolith. It's just like the left. So for example, Reach Out America is not the same as left-wing anarchists, right? You may have some things in common, you may have some goals in common, but there's really distinct differences between you. There's ideological distinctions, there's organizing distinctions, there's tactical distinctions. And so the same thing is true with the Trumpists versus the organized white supremacists. I think if that rally had been thousands of white supremacists, there would have been a lot more dead people. And they would have been a lot more, that would have been a lot more planned, and they would have hold up in the Capitol building, right? So I think there's quite a difference, and it's important to understand this difference. I mean, I kind of don't care what term you use, but people, whenever you invoke that term, they even when they say they don't, they really move to thinking like the KKK, and that's mistaken if you want to look carefully at the far right. And in fact, it obscures one thing, that it was really the moderate, it was like rank and file Trumpists who did this. We expect illegal violent actions from the most extreme groups and from groups from the far right. It's really new that masses of more moderate Trumpists, people who are in the GOP firmly, are taking these kinds of actions. And that's really the most worrisome thing for me, and bodes poorly for what's going to happen in the future. So, we'll get to the Biden. What is going to happen in the future? This is the thing everybody asks, and people want to know, but like, I'm terrible at predictions. I will tell you the things that I see that we need to look for, or what I think is going to happen. So the first thing is that the Biden administration has shown every indication that it's going to crack down on these groups. Biden in the campaign, one of the first things he said is that he was inspired by what happened at Charlottesville and by Trump's comments, and that had really convinced him that he was going to run. I mean, he was going to run anyway, but he said this, right? He's made it a real plank of his campaign, and the administration has immediately jumped into taking measures about these things with this question of new laws to give more capabilities to law enforcement. The administration is probably going to stop looking at Antifa, which has become this huge boogeyman, the way that the communist plot was in the 50s and 60s. The FBI had 40 open investigations against Antifa under the Trump administration. I don't think charges were leveled from any of them because they couldn't find anything that was a federal crime. So this whole misdirection of federal law enforcement towards the left is going to, I think, swing back where it should be, which is to the far right, who kill the vast majority of political murders, commit the vast majority of political murders every year. Since 1990, I think they've killed like 500 people in the United States. And the left has killed, if you think of it broadly, like half dozen, maybe a dozen, if you include some of these Black radical murders. In terms of the far right, QAnon, of course, has become one of the most worrisome developments of the last year. It goes back a few years, but it exploded, I think, in the like late spring, early summer. It's problematic. Those kinds of wild conspiracy theories have been around for decades about, if you may remember, it's about a cabal of satanic pedophiles who are part of the establishment and the Democratic Party. You'll read these things going back decades, so it's just sort of a rehash of these things, but it got into really centrist circles, got into yoga circles, which was one of the more interesting things, and yoga practitioners are trying to push these people out now. A lot of QAnon people left after they realized Trump wasn't gonna, make these planned arrests of the deep state. One of the wilder parts of QAnon was that when all the National Guard was there for the inauguration, they claimed that Trump was actually controlling the National Guard and they were going to help arrest Congress. So, after that didn't happen, a lot of people have left, but a core of them are definitely continuing. And that means that they're going to dig in even farther and become even more unhinged. So many of the fascists, I think, as I mentioned before, have abandoned Trump. Patriot Front, which is the biggest of the fascist groups that came out of the alt-right, denounced him before the election, said, we don't care. Democrats and Republicans, two sides of the same coin. We're not interested. The main group that's left are the Groypers, who, as I mentioned, are trying to influence remaining Trumpists and move them to the right. In fact, the other big alt-right fascist group, American Identity Movement, who used to be called Identity Europa, disbanded the day before the election to enter the Groypers. So they've been reinforced by other white supremacists. One of the things, so many experts say this movement's going to take years to deflate. Like a lot of things, my opinion is sort of the odd one out. But as I said at the beginning, that Chip and Matthew show in their book, the American far right has a boom and bust cycle. It goes up and down. Sometimes these things are quite short, 6 months or a year, a couple years. It has been very unusual. So I'll show you in the 1920s with the Ku Klux Klan, when it was a huge movement. It really was a huge movement for about 2 years, from 1920 to 1922. By the night, it influenced the 1920 election. by the 1924 election was already in decline. So it's been very unusual that it's lasted so strongly for 4 years. It's been buoyed by Trump. It's been a long time since we've had a president this far to the right. I believe the main group of people will collapse in a year. Some of this will depend on if Trump continues to be a political figure. He made the one move to say, I'm starting the Patriot Party. We'll see if that happens. I actually think that'll be a good thing, as we've all seen for our whole lives that third parties are just dead ends in American politics. So, it'll draw their energy into being in a party. As I'm sure y'all do a lot of electioneering for the Democrats. It's a lot of effort to participate in the party, to run candidates, to deal with campaigns, to go door to door. And I think it's a really energy drain. So I do kind of hope that he even forms that. We'll see if he does speaking tours or tries to remain a public figure. It may be possible that one of his children, and I think Don Jr. would be the most likely candidate, try to take up his mantle. So there's many different things could happen. We'll also see how many Trumpists in the Republican Party, remain as such. Where in this election we've already seen, that Marjorie Greene is gonna keep the flag waving, and Cruz is not going to change anytime soon. Some of this depends if their base, is going to reelect them. So it doesn't matter what everyone else thinks. We'll see how strong the Trumpists remain. I was sure before, but I hope there's a fight within the Republican Party by the non-Trumpists to drive the Trumpists out or marginalize them. They're on good ground to do this because they're like, well, we went along with your candidate, but he lost. And as a party, our goal is to win elections. You didn't, so we need to try something else. But, so many people have not, some Republican elected officials are not, going along with the impeachment, that this may not really be the case. So again, other people think that it's going to be years for this movement to deflate. I'm hoping a year, maybe 2 at the most. So one of the most worrisome things is that I think all experts, including myself, agree is that we're in the next year or so, there's going to be scattered far-right terrorism. Some of it's going to come from neo-Nazi groups and other white supremacists, but some of it's going to come from angry Trumpists. If you remember that guy who was lived in a van or had a van filled with Trump stickers and was sending mail bombs to George Soros and all these officials, he was a Trumpist. He wasn't like a neo-Nazi or anything. And I'm afraid we're going to have more of that, more people like that, QAnon adherents. There's been several instances of them already engaging in violence. One of them, you may remember, a couple years ago, killed a mob boss on Long Island. Didn't have to do with him being in the mob. It had to do with his daughter and the guy dating his daughter. But he went into court with like Q on his hand. So we may see more violence from these groups because the Trumpists, and the white supremacists don't have a political avenue anymore. They truly believe that the election was stolen. They think that Biden is a communist, which I think is insane because I think he's a center-right Democrat. I mean, he's no Bernie Sanders, and Sanders isn't a communist either. And they believe, if you haven't watched this rhetoric, is that Biden's going to take their guns, which is the same thing that happens every time a Democrat is elected. But this is also going to drive the militia and patriot movements. They're the part of the far right, I think, are most likely to benefit from Biden's administration in the next 4 years. They traditionally flourish under a Democratic administration because they have an anti-federal government perspective and they call for a right-wing decentralization. And strangely, we didn't think that they would. They flourished under Trump by sort of pivoting and attaching themselves to Trump. But now they're in a very easy position to move back and be anti-Biden in a way that groups like the Proud Boys, who really hitched their train to Trump, there's no real place for them to go next. They'll have to figure out a place to go. So I hope that wasn't too short. I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions and have a discussion now.
Great, thank you, Spencer. That was amazing. For those of you that are here that want to ask questions, go down to the bottom, almost to the right, and it says Q&A, and just press on that, and you can type in some questions for our speaker, because that would be really helpful. Let's see, we've got somebody, Stephen. He says, thank you very much. Are you able at some point to ask the speaker to say a little about Primal Leadership by Daniel Goldman, how leaders and people supposedly construe shared emotional dynamic and the relevance here.
Haven't read the book. Definitely true that leaders, one of the functions of leaders, and in particularly the president, and I get in this argument with radical leftists a lot who are like, oh, the president's all the same. And I'm like, no, they really, it's a interesting psychological mechanism they have. Policies aside, you know, presidents set the temperature of the country. We've seen under Trump that they can create these fanatical followers. We saw this under Biden too. You know, there's kind of a cult of Obama. Sorry, Biden. That's great. I kind of like that. You know, FDR has the same thing. I went to his like summer house. I think it's upstate, and there are all these people who are super FDR fans. So yeah, there is this sort of interesting psychological, you know, dialectic, if you will, between leaders and particularly presidents and citizens, and so. That's just a fact of political life, probably in all cultures and all times.
So I have a question. You were talking about how that different demonstrators would be approached differently by the you know, the police and everything. Is that because it's the Trump administration that you're saying that if it was, you know, because since Trump has you know, was in charge, so when things happen, if it were a leftist group that was coming and Biden is the president, are you saying that it would be a different feel
than under Trump?
Yeah. I'm
Well,
just curious why that is, like why you think that you know, that the
it
National
is
Guard or whoever.
national.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
You mean specifically like in DC, or you mean nationally? Because they're
No,
actually
just nationally, just like you were saying, when demonstrators, if it was a leftist group, they would have been, you know, there would have, you know, everybody would have been lined up, ready, waiting for them, and but not so much. They're so much nicer to the right-wing groups. So my thought is that because of the we had that present administration, with that shift given the Biden administration?
Yes, but it's a bit of a difficult question. I think the hands-off approach at the Capitol definitely wouldn't have happened. We don't know why it was so understaffed, but we do know at this point there was some amount of clear pressure from above to ignore these warnings. You know, the FBI gave warnings and stuff, and they would have definitely, and I believe under a Biden administration, taken the warnings much more seriously. Now, police in each city, if people don't know this, are you know, they're local police. We don't have federal police like other countries do. This has been one of the problems for the Black Lives Matter movement, is that, you know, civil rights movements in the past have pressured the federal government to create a national change. And because the police are not federalized, it's very difficult to do that. You almost have to do it city by city and county by county. And in some places like Portland, Oregon, the police are basically autonomous. You know, even with an overwhelming desire to rein the police in there, who've been out of control for decades. I lived there in the 90s and they were totally out of control. And in fact, I lived there when one of the city councilors was an activist there who in the last 4 years has been on the council. And she was like, there's nothing we can do. Their contract is an iron, which was signed before the new mayor and the new council, is an ironclad contract that allows them to be completely autonomous. So they can do what they want, but I think the Trump administration has set the tone for this, and that they will moderate some just as the political tone of the country tampers down, that they will, if not become less aggressive with the left, become less conciliatory with the right. And I think there'll be fewer angry right-wing demonstrations for sure. You know, Trump allowed that, and that there just aren't going to be so many demonstrations of that caliber for them to allow, you know, to go without cracking down on it. So again, the president is a very strong influence in setting the political temperature of the country. The police are generally far right. Attitudes are the norm amongst the police, and so those attitudes, I'm sure, were ramped up by Trump.
Thank you. Well, let's see. Harriet asks, will all the people whom the FBI got tips about be followed up on?
So definitely not, and I'll tell you why. In January, mid-January, the FBI had already received 100,000 tips. There's no way they can follow up on all these people. They are accepting tips. I think they will follow up on anyone who you provide evidence for, like social media screenshots and video where they're like, I helped murder that cop, or, you know, I broke into the building. That I think they will. But they're putting out lists of, periodically updating lists of people that they want, and those are the ones that they're most interested in. So I don't think they could possibly investigate them all, but they are very aggressively investigating and arresting people. There've been almost 250 arrests now.
Wow, that was going to be my next question. Do you have any idea how many people have they actually isolated?
The last time I checked, which was the last data I got, which was a couple days ago, was there was 237 arrests. More than half were just for trespassing, which I think it's fair. If you just went into the building, we don't need to charge these people with felonies. The other half, though, are charged with, I think, mostly felonies for for assault, for disrupting government proceedings, a variety of things.
Great, thank you. Rita asked, do you think these groups will be as bold without Trump in the White House?
No, but some of them are going to be driven further to the right. And there's splinters right now in the Proud Boys, for example. They started fighting with the police and authorities, which they had never done in the weeks before the Capitol takeover. So that split was already happening. They're moving toward a more revolutionary perspective, which is what we saw in the 80s with the white supremacist groups, which is partly why they were so incredibly violent then.
Let's see. My question is, shouldn't there be a special task force for domestic terrorism beside the Joint Terrorism Task Force and legislation? Because there's not real domestic legislation out there to arrest people for domestic violence.
Not exactly true. There is no list of banned domestic terrorist groups. There is a list of external ones that are banned, and you can't even raise money or support them. ISIS and Hezbollah and some of these other groups. And we can debate if some of the groups like Hamas or Hezbollah should be on them, but there's no internal group. I am not impressed by the actions of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I think they're largely unaccountable. Their work with the local police, there's tons of garbage information. I'm not convinced that they are a great structure. I think this attitude is widely held by both civil libertarians and groups on the left, is that we don't need any new laws. There are tons and tons of laws that already exist to deal with domestic terrorism. It's true there's not a domestic terrorism law, but I don't think we need them. I think it's good that people are not. The problem with having a domestic ban list is you start persecuting people because of their ideology, or even members of an organization. That would quickly boomerang on the left, right? And we really want every member of the Communist Party, which still exists, or DSA, to be arrested as a terrorist. I think it's right and proper for people to be arrested for specific crimes. There is already, under the Patriot Act, which again is a very expansive act that needs to be gutted or gotten rid of. Once you're convicted of certain crimes, you have to be charged in the old crime. Once you're convicted, there's a very large sentencing enhancer. So a lot of people convicted under groups that have been deemed unofficially by the FBI as terrorists sometimes get extremely long sentences, and that's already in place. So basically, this is a question of political will. I don't think there needs to be new task forces. I do believe that the federal government and other existing structures need to turn their attention to the far right, but the structures are already there. It's a question of will.
Okay, Nina asked a question. So Spencer, if you feel that it wasn't such a far right organization groups during January 6th, is it more likely they can convict Trump on inciting the riot?
Because there weren't so many organized groups?
Because you were saying that they weren't all white supremacist groups or organized groups. It was really Trumpist group,
Yeah.
people that were very Trumpers.
No, I think it makes it worse because he doesn't have, he has less ground to stand on. I mean, I don't know what's going on with the proceedings. I'm just going to wait and see the end. He has less ground to stand on that, it wasn't me, there were organized groups doing it. Now it's like, well, why did all these grassroots people take this action? So I think it's worse for him. Right. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't know, but that's just my general opinion.
Yeah, great. Let's see. Jeanette asked, which U.S. states have the most right-wing, alt-right, militia, KKK affiliated or neo-Nazi groups?
Okay, so I looked this up ahead of time. Thank you for this. Is a specific question. So let me just, if you're interested in following things, there's a division of labor between the organizations, nonprofits that monitor the far right. The Anti-Defamation League keeps up every year with the number of murders by political extremists. And the Southern Poverty Law Center issues their annual hate map, which has all the groups. And they just both put them out within the last few weeks. So the states with the most are California's number one, which has, I'll give you two different numbers. One is the number of hate groups, and the second is hate groups plus militias, which are tracked differently. California has 72 hate groups, but 123 total with militias. Florida has 68 hate groups and 95 total. I'll say far-right groups total. Texas has 54 hate groups and 83 far-right groups. And then Ohio has 21 hate groups, but 72 far-right groups total. And if you're interested, New York has 37 hate groups and 59 groups total. We have a bunch of militias upstate. So those are yeah, California, Florida, Texas, and Ohio. Ohio was really the weird one for me, but they have tons of militias and patriot groups, it looks like.
That's interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought there'd be more like northwestern states, so that's surprising to me.
Yeah. Well, some of them are more sparsely. Some of this is population. California is hugely populated. A lot of those Northwest states are have very low population density.
Okay, I have another question. Is there a way to reform neo-Nazis or some kind of tolerance training for these white supremacist groups? And how does one get another one to stop hating? I mean, it's a crazy question, but
No, it's a good
curious.
question. I mean, we think about this a lot. We would rather head off these groups than try to somehow contain them. And you don't want people in these groups because they commit terrorism and murder people and stuff. There's programs like teaching tolerance in the schools. There's already multiracial curriculum and stuff. That can't hurt. I couldn't tell you if that's effective or not. It would be hard to judge that, but it certainly can't hurt for people, to think about questions of racial disparities, or to gain appreciations for other cultures. I think there's plenty of cases of white supremacists actually being on good terms with people of color and even Jews, that it's not like a question of a personal antagonism, although there's that too. But it can't hurt for white people to have good, friendships and other good relationships with people of color. It's definitely going to make them, and Jewish people, it's definitely going to make them less likely to become white supremacists. It can't possibly make them more likely. Getting people out of the movement, this is a particular interest of mine because this is really what we want. We want all of these people to become, they're called formers. We want all of white supremacists to become former white supremacists, right? We're not going to kill them all. If you put them in jail, they run into neo-Nazi prison gangs and they're heroes because they're political prisoners. That doesn't help anybody, and prisons just don't help anybody. It's not a good experience. Makes people, generally, they come out much worse. So we want them to leave their movement. There are organizations like Life After Hate and Free Radicals, and also a bunch of independent people who do this because there's so many problems with the organizations that are largely formers themselves, used to be in the white power movement, and help people who want to leave. Now, it's a little sticky because people have to want to leave or be interested in leaving to contact these organizations. So you have to be, we found it, people say you have to fight hate speech with more speech. The problem is that doesn't really work. I have never in my life convinced a conspiracy theorist out of their views. I've never convinced a committed white supremacist out of their views. If they want to leave or they're, have just left, then you can help them. And you can have resources for them to leave. There's a big problem with recidivism. They'll often go back because once you get deeply involved in political movements, they become your social network. They become the cultural things you do. Maybe you meet your partner in these things. And a lot of these people don't have great lives. Once, your job may be tied to it. Once these people leave, they lose all these resources, and sometimes they go back because they don't have them. So you want to provide some of these resources or help them to move beyond this emotionally or psychologically to have that need, or at least to move them in a different direction, and where that need is fulfilled, maybe into a religion, maybe into a different kind of politics. I don't like to put them into the left, but into a religious circle or some sort of other thing where they can get some of those same things they've been craving. So yeah, people have to be, what we've seen generally is that people burn out, and if you can catch them when they're in the emotional space where they're ready to leave, then you can get them. But in general, it's very hard. However, since we've seen that these movements rise and fall, and then just like the left, when people become, not you all are mostly older, right? You're committed progressives, but you'll see this in younger people. They get very involved and they're involved for a year or two and then they drop off. so we're going to see the same thing happens with them. In fact, a neo-Nazi terrorist advocate, James Mason, calls it for Nazis the 18-month syndrome, where new activists would come in and they'd be very aggressive for 18 months and then they'd leave. So these movements are going, people are churning in and out. They'll leave on their own, but they don't leave fast enough for my taste. So it's a good question, but it's a difficult answer.
Okay, thank you. For those of you that are attending the webinar, if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A to ask Spencer, because he has a lot of wonderful insight that we certainly don't have. Let's see, Myra, any connection between known gangs and these groups?
Like, what's a gang? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. Myra, why don't you write down what you mean by gangs?
I think she means like MS-13 or something.
Ah,
If
okay.
you're talking about these real street gangs, not really. I mean, some of the far right groups like the Proud Boys act like gangs, American Guard, there's national skinhead groups like Blood and Honor and Vinlanders, they're gangs. They act like gangs. If you're talking about the prison gangs, or white supremacists in particular prison gangs, they don't really mess with actual politics. They're into drug dealing. They kill a lot of people, but they generally kill their own people for betraying them or being snitches. So they're actually kind of two different things. There's not a lot of crossover. In fact, I just asked the former leader of the biggest neo-Nazi group in the US, he was their leader for 27 years, Jeff Scoop, formerly of the National Socialist Movement, if members of Nazi prison gangs had been part of his party. And he said no. He didn't just say no, that wasn't really the case, but he said they weren't allowed dual membership in the party because then they were splitting. It was very interesting from an organizational perspective. He was a very good organizer. He said, well, they're splitting their time and energy between the two groups and we want 100% commitment. And I'm sure these gangs also want, a lot of them are blood in, blood out. You can't leave them or it's very dangerous for you to leave them. And they probably also don't want you splitting your commitment.
Well, I have a question. How did you get into this? Like what drew you to doing this?
Well, this is the story. So I grew up in a small town in Georgia. There were Klan rallies there. Frequently, there was a sort of picturesque courthouse. The Klan liked to rally there. So even when I was a little kid, I remember lots of Klan rallies. The president of the John Birch Society was our congressional rep. He was actually killed in that 1983 airliner shoot down, I think above Korea or something. It was almost like a crazy conspiracy theory, right? Like the head of JBS is killed by communists. And then I was in high school in 1988, which was the year of the big Nazi skinhead explosion. I was in the punk rock scene. I had a Black girlfriend. Part of my family's Jewish. And so I, let's say, quickly entered into conflict with these people. The Nazis were dominating the Atlanta punk rock scene, which had thousands of people in it. I ended up meeting a group of very savvy, very effective political group who were of older people, although it's sort of embarrassing now, they're younger than I am now. I always, of course, think of them as older, who were doing very good monitoring and legal monitoring and counter organizing, were very effective. And I ended up meeting them and they were very interesting people, started reading political stuff through them and hanging out with them. They introduced me to some other teenagers who had contacted them and we formed a youth anti-racist group. I mean, now we would call it a legal anti-fascist group to do counter propaganda and organizing in the punk rock scene. And we actually had an effect. It was my first political experience. I became involved in left-wing politics around 2005. I was in grad school here in New York City, and there were two things that drew me back to this work. One, we found a fascist group trying to cross-recruit from the anti-globalization movement. They were called National Anarchists. They were an outgrowth of British fascist politics. They were still fascist, but they were using like left-wing symbols and sort of some external stuff. And I became really fascinated by that. And they were more intellectual than most of these groups. So they were talking about all these fascist intellectuals I'd never heard of, like Otto Strasser and Julius Evola and these different European movements. So I got very interested in who these people were. The other was left-wing anti-Semitism. We found people really from the anti-Zionist movement getting too deeply involved in some of these politics around 2005, 2006, which I thought was really the worst point for that. And when we confronted them, they, dug their heels in about it. So we became very interested in, I and some others, the question of anti-Semitism on the left at first, but then once you get interested on the left, it's just anti-Semitism. And so it blended in with the far right studies. I wrote a famous essay in 2008 that was translated into several languages about the national anarchists for this think tank, Political Research Associates, the one that Chip Berlay had founded. They asked me to become a fellow there when I was done with school, and then I started producing reports and getting deeper into far-right monitoring. So I was in a good position, you know, when Trump was elected. I already had a background in this stuff and have been producing literature and research on it.
No, thank you. That's really fascinating. I'll do like about 2 more questions, if that's okay. Um, let's say Nina has a question. She said, the New York Times recently published an article about the history of white supremacy. And she was really shocked to learn that these groups have been organized online since the 80s, since the beginning of the internet. That's 40 years, and the internet's now so vast and platforms so vary and ever changing. How is it possible to keep up with all the groups organizing online?
Yeah, so their history is really disturbing. The first Nazi BBS was started in 1983, and it was started by a guy who had been in Hitler Youth in the 1930s, George Dietz, and quickly followed by a bunch of others. So yeah, the internet's very useful for white supremacists because it's difficult for them to appear and organize in public. This allows them to do it privately. It is hard that they keep jumping into these more and more obscure platforms. Even I've sort of lost track, and there are younger people who love doing this. I mean, I used to do this kind of work, investigating individuals and doxing them, and I think it's very good. You just have to have committed people follow them down the rabbit hole. At some point, though, if these things become mass movements, they can't use these obscure little platforms. They have to use something that's accessible to ordinary, everyday people. Everyone isn't gonna, especially older people, because a lot of these people are, much younger, who are figuring out these new ways. Like one thing they use is a Discord, which is a communication service designed for online gamers. Like, who would have thought to use that to coordinate stuff? So if they ever want to be a bigger movement, they have to move off these niche platforms. But you have to have committed people who follow them, very closely. And I think there should be funding for groups like that. There's not. It's a lot of people do it for free, and I think there needs to be more structured funding to help these people. They do it. It's a huge amount of work. Like, they should be able to quit their jobs and do this full time. It's good for the rest of us.
Great. A last question. Sandy asks, would it be an infringement on free speech if the Congress legislated stricter rules governing what appears on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google?
So it's a complicated question. I'm not a First Amendment lawyer. There's a question of what's free speech and what's the First Amendment, right? There's what's legal and what do people consider free speech, right? So legally, there are laws that say internet platforms do not have to follow the same rules that other publishers do. They are not liable for content on them, right? This has started to crack down a little bit. So child pornography and other things, support for ISIS is changing. Trademark content, as you probably know, will be taken down very quickly. So it's changed some, which shows that the platforms can do it if they want. Also that, Facebook's like, oh, it's just too much of a big deal. It's too many, they can do it if they want to do it. Again, this is a will question, or twisting people's arms into doing it. There are attempts to alter the law that says that platforms aren't publishers and aren't liable, to include, and I think there's bills now, or there have been very recently, to include libel and calls for violence. And the law is that there has to be clear and present danger for that call for violence. But we could have seen that in the Capitol. And I don't know that that's a bad idea. It is annoying that people can be libeled. I don't know if people know this. I became the target of a national conspiracy theory. Lynn Wood, who's one of the people forwarding the Kraken lawsuits, claimed I was the QAnon shaman, the guy with the horns and the, face paint, who was photographed on the Senate dais and the takeover. He claimed that I personally was him. He tweeted it out and he had 1 million followers. So, that's libel. I started talking to libel lawyers and I was like, can I sue him? So I don't think this is a bad idea. It's limited. A bill will have to be passed. I don't see why these platforms shouldn't be covered by the same rules that other publishers are. I think that anything beyond that won't, whether you think it's a good idea or not, will not be constitutionally allowed. And I think you also need to consider that where there are very strict rules about this content, like in Germany, it doesn't stop these movements from existing. You can't wave a Nazi flag in Germany or deny the Holocaust or say Heil Hitler in public or private. And it doesn't, there's a big neo-Nazi movement there. So we need to be careful about, even if you want these laws, about what the real world, even if there isn't blowback, because there might always be blowback on the left, will they really have the effect that you want? And it makes things more taboo, and then people are drawn to the taboos themselves.
Great, good point. Well, thank you, Spencer, so much. It's really been very informative to have you. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Nina, for bringing Spencer on here. And I just have a few things to end the meeting. I want to do a shout out to Nassau County Legislator Ellen Birnbaum, who's on our meeting. Thank you for being here, Ellen. And want to let you know, if you wanted to see some of our previous webinars that we've done, North Shore TV is actually just started this month. They're airing them Wednesdays today at 3 p.m. So you can catch our previous webinars, and I'm sure this one will probably be added in the next few weeks. So that's a great way to follow up if you missed any of our past webinars. And please join us next month. We have our guest speaker is Congressman Tom Suozzi. I am sure that he's going to have so much to share with us. It's going to be a terrific meeting. So thank you all again. Thank you, Spencer and Nina, and wish you all a really good month. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.